Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming to our event today. My name is Natalie Gomez. I am the BIPOC caucus member of AKINE. I'm also an Easthampton Ordinance Committee member and an Easthampton resident. We're broadcasting live on Facebook, as well as Easthampton Media is also broadcasting on channel 191. So our guest today is Carl Williams, and I will let him speak.
Sure. Thanks so much, Natalie. My name's Carl Williams. I'm a civil rights and community lawyer, activist, organizer, and I do some teaching a little bit sometimes from Boston. I'm here in Boston in the snow right now, and I'm glad to be with you all.
Perfect. So we're gonna discuss some etiquette regarding the event. We are asking everyone to please display their names, turn on your camera if it's possible, be curious and respectful, be present, take care of your needs, commit to learning and action, be compelled to think beyond what is said, ask thoughtful questions. Ground rules for the Q&A will be after the dialogue between me and Carl. Please hold all of your questions. During the question and answer period, you can raise your hands to ask a question and hosts will call on you. Please take no more than 1 minute to ask a question and do not simply make statements. We have the definition for BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous, People of Color. It's a term for non-white people, especially as they face racism and discrimination. So we're going to talk about the history of law enforcement. Carl, would you like to elaborate, please?
That's a big start, but thank you so much. And thank you all for having me here. So I think to start with, I think we have to go back to the founding of the United States of America and think of what we, on one hand, what we know about that and what some of the myths about that are, right? Because we all have, we have family myths, we have myths about our communities, we have myths about, the founding of the United States, because it's, in what I learned in maybe first or second grade was the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and these sort of holy documents in the founding of the United States, and about the Pilgrims, and about Thanksgiving, and how that operated, right? But then there's what we actually know, right? Things that everybody has these facts in their minds, and sometimes those things don't jibe, right? They don't meet together properly, right? Because one of the things that we know, right, we might not want to always think about it this way because it makes it difficult, is that the United States was founded by people who said we believe in religious freedom, was founded by people in the United States, well, for some people, and was founded by people who said we think that voting might be a good idea for some people, right? They didn't mean a lot of people. A lot of people who are on this call probably weren't going to vote in, 1779 or thereabouts. So two of the things that we have to remember is that this country was founded on land that was taken from indigenous people, right? Of course, because the country, what became the United States of America, was entirely populated by many millions of people, many hundreds of nations of people, not a single nation. It wasn't just indigenous people. It was many nations of people, many of those that don't exist anymore. It was founded on one hand on the land of indigenous people, and then secondarily, it was founded with the labor of many people, but one was chattel labor, free labor, enslaved labor of Black folks, of enslaved Africans. Those two pieces are very distinct, very powerful vestiges of how this country was founded. And they're also baked into, so I'm going to make that bridge, they're baked into the legal structure of this country. So when we look at the Constitution, it's a really simple place to do it. And you can remember it really easily, because I need easy ways to remember these things. It's Article 1, Section 2, Paragraph 3 of the Constitution. It's in the first article. It's in the very first part of it, well, before the introduction, it's in the first article. So it's kind of the important part of the Constitution. And it talks about Black people. It doesn't use the term Black people. It doesn't use the term Negro or enslaved person, but it talks about Black people. And it says they are 3/5 of a human being. They count in proportional representation for 3/5 of a human being. And the fact that today we're talking about racial justice in the legal system, and when we go way back to the actual founding piece of paper, there were many pieces of original constitutions, but the piece of paper that founded this country says that people on this phone call are not human beings, right? That is still in the Constitution. It is, I used to work in a building in downtown Boston, the John Hancock building, and carved in stone in the, it was marble wall. Like it says, they didn't do that part on purpose because they did the whole Constitution, but it says, I would walk in and be like, oh, look, in marble on the wall, it says that I'm not a person, right? It also, I would be remiss to leave out the second part of that sentence says that it doesn't say indigenous people or Indians or native peoples, but it refers to them in a way that people at the time would understand. It says other people not taxed, and it says don't count at all. Don't even count as human beings. So even less than Black people. So when we have these pillars of how the United States was founded, it was founded in this idea that there are people who count as human beings, explicitly, there are people who count as human beings and there are people who do not count as human beings. And since that existence, Black folks, brown folks, and other marginalized people have had to battle with the legal system, in the way they're treated by police, in the way they're treated by the courts, in the way they're treated, in their possibility to serve on juries, in their way they have an ability to vote. And that has resulted in policing and the criminal legal system being deeply problematic for people of color and specifically Black people. And it has always been that way. So I think that's from whence we came, and I think it gives us some grounding. And I think it's also healthy to think about this. Like it sounds like that's really bad. But if we think, we kind of built this house on a shaky foundation, and we should look at that and say, you know what? We're resourceful people. We're smart people. We're a really broad group of people in this country and in our communities, and we can fix that, right? But if we really want to fix it, we have to understand that it's very, very deeply rooted in this country.
Very true. That brings me to my next point is regarding law enforcement and the racist history. When you talk about the racist history of it, can you explain it better?
Sure. And this is not something that I'm going to put this forward. I think it's difficult for people to hear this. It might have been difficult for people to hear the thing that I just said, or maybe a thing that people can agree with. To some extent, policing in the United States was founded on three different things. So the Boston Police Department will frequently say that it was the first full-time professional police department in the country. I'm sure there are other police departments that will argue that. It's a fair cop to say it was one of the first. So we must look at the Boston Police Department and say, where did policing come from? Also, in the West, the way indigenous people were concentrated into camps of reservations, and what when people say like Fort Laramie and all these other forts that are in places like Colorado and like in Nebraska, these are places that indigenous people were rounded up and were forced to stay there by armed people enforcing laws. So that's in the West. In the South, enslaved people had to be obviously like on the person who they had to be on the land of the person who enslaved them, right? They were not allowed to leave, but they could have a pass because maybe they had to go pick up some lumber, or they had to go, get a horse shoot, or they had to, buy some food or run errands or do labor. So you'd have a pass from your enslaver, right? People use the term master. I don't really like the term master, but from the person who enslaved you, they would give you a pass and they'd say you're allowed to go. So a lot of times people would be like, oh yeah, I have a pass, and they didn't, right? They were, absconding from where they were legally required to be, not morally required to be, but legally required to be. So a system evolved to check to see if enslaved people were where they were supposed to be, and to check their passes. So what would happen is plantations would have a volunteer. They would have to like put in a day a week or a day a month, right? And it was a rotating schedule of people. And those people became known as patrollers, right? People who would patrol streets and check enslaved people who were out after hours, who were out maybe places they wouldn't be. And if not, they would take them and bring them back to where they were enslaved, right? That system is part of what later evolved into county sheriffs, police departments in the South, and the structure of policing that we see. That is at least some part of it. We can argue that that was like 80% of where police came from or 5%, but that is part of the history of policing, right? Because these people were identifiable at times. These people had insignia at times that they wore to say that, you know, I'm on patrol doing this thing. And even the name patrollers sounds like is similar to the name, and it is purposely similar to the name of patroller. In the North, it was not that. You know, the Boston police, when they were founded, were not going around looking for enslaved people for the most part. What they were doing is mostly suppressing labor action, right? People were like, working class people were saying like, we'd rather not work 90 hours a week, right? We'd rather maybe work 70, right? And people would organize and say, we want to work less and we want Sunday off because we want to go to church. And people organized and did that. And the first actions and that organized business said, they said, we want police so we can make it so these people can't strike. So we can make it so these people can't close our factories. So we can make it so these people have to go back to work, right? So you have in the North, police as strikebreakers and controlling people organizing for labor rights. In the South, we have police, or what would become police, controlling what enslaved people were doing, right? Black enslaved people. And in the West, it was controlling what indigenous people were doing on what was previously their land. And those roots, those aren't the only roots, right? There's the Night Watch that existed, and we could go into a long history about that, and hue and cry, and a whole bunch of things of the history of policing. But those are three pillars that I think are important to this discussion, because when we say that there's racialized policing, when we say that police are doing racist things, it isn't because there's one bad cop, right? It's because there's a system that's been put in place for the entire existence of this country, for the entire history of policing in this country, that says, those are Black people, those are brown people. Generally, we're going to focus our attention on those people, Black, brown, poor, indigenous people. And depending on where you are in the country, sometimes it's a slightly different group. So like, you know, if I'm in San Jose, it's a slightly different discussion than if you're in, you know, if you're in Homer, Alaska, where the population of color is mostly indigenous folks. Or in South Dakota. I was recently in South Dakota, and the discussions there are slightly different, but it's always poor people. It's always indigenous people. It's always Black people, right, in this country, from Portland, Oregon to Portland, Maine, to San Juan to San Jose and Anchorage and Honolulu. Yeah. There are problems with policing in every major city in this country and the small towns in between.
Okay, so yes, as we talk about that, one of the big questions that I hear a lot, what are your takes on the so-called school resource officers and the basically the school to prison pipeline? People think it's not real. What do you think about it?
Hit me these huge questions, and I'm like, oh my God, there's so many things to say. So in Boston, we have school police, right? And I see their cars and it says Boston School Police. And then every time I go to a meeting, people are like, I'm the school resource officer. And if you just said to the average person on the street, I'm a school resource officer, and they had never heard those words in a row before, they would be like, huh. I used to have, in my school, we had a resource room, and it was a place where you could go get like pencils, and they had dictionaries you could borrow. I think they had, what do you call those things? Protractor? And like compasses, so you could draw circles. I'm old, so these are the things we had in school. And they had computers. They were they were TRS-80s in like a million years ago. And these are the very first computers that schools had. But that was the resource room because it had resources in it. The term school resource officer seems a little euphemistic to me. I mean, it's a police officer that is paid, usually in some structure by a police department or by a municipality, to purportedly to enforce laws, sometimes to arrest people, sometimes to divert people from situations where they could be arrested. That's school police. So we could call them school police, but I think it's a little of a packaging term to refer to a school police officer as a school resource officer. I realize some people's heads probably exploded when I said that, but if you got a badge and you can arrest people legally in this state, I can tell you by the statute, right? If someone if someone hits that person, it is assault and battery on a police officer. It's not assault and battery on a school resource officer. Or does that person have the power of arrest? Yes, they have the power of arrest because they're a police officer, right? You can read statutes in Massachusetts that says this person can arrest somebody. If someone doesn't allow that school police officer to arrest them, they can be charged with resisting arrest because they're a police officer, right? So I don't think that might not be comfortable, but that is not, it doesn't seem like that can be a controversial thing to say. So that's about the just terminology of that. I think we should be clear. We shouldn't be euphemistic about things. And that's not to say that that's a bad thing that someone is a school police officer. However, it is the case, and the American Civil Liberties Union of Massachusetts did a study, it's not quite recent, but so it's about, let me guess, about 7 or 8 years ago. And they studied Worcester, Boston, and Springfield school systems and examined how many police officers were in those schools and how many things like guidance counselors and other social service workers were in those schools. And I'll say this as a question just for everyone. You don't have to answer it, but you can answer it in your minds. The teacher in me does these. So what do you think people saw for levels of arrests in relation to the number of school police officers in a school? So more police officers, do you think that resulted in the same amount of arrests, lower arrests, or more arrests? In our minds, let's think of what that does.
Well, I'll say it out loud. I would assume more.
To a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So if you have a school police officer in the thing that says, you're a police officer, here's the school. What happens is people arrest people for things that if you were in Concord Carlisle School in very wealthy part of Massachusetts, right? They have guidance counselors there. They have, school therapists there. So if a kid, real case from Boston, if a kid throws a carrot it wasn't a baby carrot, it was a medallion. It was a, like a silver dollar shaped piece of a carrot, threw a carrot in a school, was arrested for assault and battery, taken and went through. The reason I know about that case is because there was a juvenile public defender who was defending that person, right? And not to say that's not everyone, not every school police officer is doing that. But the thing is, the more people you put in there to say your job is to enforce the law here, it's going to result in more arrests. If you put more school nurses in schools, if you put more guidance counselors, I'll say, I remember when I was in 6th grade and I was doing really bad in a class, I swear to you, it was public speaking. And I had to do a speech a week and I never did any of them because I was too terrified to speak. And I got sent to the office. I'm like, I'm in trouble. I got sent to the office and I met this woman. Her name is Miss Paris. She's out there listening. Thank you, Miss Paris. She's like, public speaking is a really important thing. You should try to do it. And I know it's hard and it makes you scared. I go, yeah, it makes my palms sweat. And she's like, you should try. And if you need anything, I'm here for you. And I was like, I'm old. How old are you in 6th grade? Like how old are you?
12.
So this is, now you're going to say how old I am. That was 38, 39 years ago, right? I remember her saying that. I remember where I sat and she had a little cubicle and I sat against this wall and she was like over to my right. She had an electric typewriter on her desk because I'm really old. And paying for that for paying for police in schools says something. It says something about what we want to do with our children. Do we want to have them one step away from being arrested, or do we want them one step away from good public health care with nurses, good psychological state with therapists and other folks in our school, good guidance counselor, good tracks towards college, right? So you could track kids towards school. I went to not to brag, but I went to an exam school. It's not the one in Boston, but it was the one in Providence, Rhode Island. And there, just everyone assumed that we would all go to college, right? It was a school it was like 98% white kids. And everyone's like, well, what college? It would only be like, what college are you going to? Not, are you going to college or what are you going to do? And all the guidance counselors treated us that way. All the teachers treated us that way. And all the not police that we had in our school didn't treat us anyway because we didn't have police in our school, right? But we had resources. We had computers at the time, very, very expensive. We had all of those things. directly because we weren't paying salaries for people with weapons or possibly some schools or people with arrest powers in our schools.
Which is,
I'm
I
sorry.
also grew up. No, I also grew up without police officers.
And I just want to say one other thing about that. And sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Like, I sort of did mean to interrupt, but I just, there's one important bit. Everyone always says, right? So it bleeds, it leads, it's on the news, crime, crime, crime. Oh my God, people are running around with, like MP5s and they're shooting everybody. And there are so many school shootings. The two high points, I'll say this as a question too. In the last, so let's say from 1900 to right now. And if we think, what are the two high points of crime, like the years of crime? People think like, oh, crime is getting worse and worse and worse. Crime was really, really, really bad in the United States in the early 1920s, in the very early, like about 1970. And then it wasn't quite as bad at all, but it was a sort of high points in the early 1990s, right? And that was the rise of crack and the sort of resultant effects on communities. And all of the other points in between that, it was basically going down. So for the most part, crime for the last, depending on how you measure it, but if you're talking about FBI statistics and you're talking about major crimes, for the last 30 years, crime has generally been on a steep decrease. I say that to people and they go, you're out of your mind. I go, I'm not telling you the FBI statistics, I'm not making this up. It's not the ACLU or some moderately lefty or liberal organization. It's crime statistics, right? And they're pretty clear. Like it's like murder, rape, robbery, assault, carjacking, use of weapons. Those have been on the decline, right? But police budgets, not on the decline. Having police in schools, not on the decline. Having metal detectors and security systems and arrests in schools, not on the decline, right? So there seems to be an interrupt there. Like, why is that the case? You could say, well, because we have so many police in schools, then nobody commits crime anymore. My opinion, I don't think that that's the case. What it is I think, we live in a society that fear can lead, and we say, oh, it's terrible. We have to have, metal detectors, and we have to have school police, and we have to have, and I mean, you can see these examples in schools systems where there were security guards, where there were police. It didn't, like, no one jumped in and like pulled a John Wayne and like stopped a shooter and saved everybody. And that's not to say that people who are employed in those places didn't do heroic work, but I mean, one of them, I think, Parkland, I think the guy got charged. I can't remember, but I think one of the security guards, he left or something. And I'm not trying to besmirch all people who do that security work, but I just to say, having more police, just saying we're going to spend more and more and more money on police, does not make, that expenditure does not make our community safer. And very specifically in a time of pandemic, right? I can think of a few things that we could spend money on.
I can too, definitely. So one of the big things that we definitely have dealt with is the weaponizing of fear and the other, and what happens when people do that. What is your take on that and weaponizing fear against the BIPOC community?
So I think this happened a lot I mean, it's happened throughout the history of the United States in many ways. And you could pick a decade or pick a century, and we can give examples of what that looked like. And I'm going to go back to a founding document. I'll say the quote and people can think, do you know where this is from? But the merciless Indian savages, fairly racist thing to say, right? I have some friends who are indigenous and they have t-shirts that say merciless Indian savage, which I think is really funny because it's a quote from a document. Does anybody know what it is?
I do not know what it is.
You never heard of this document. Wasn't very consequential in the history of the United States. It's called the Declaration of Independence. It's written in 1776. And in that, I'm teasing you, in that, the Declaration of Independence is a letter. It's sort of a hate letter to the King of England, right? It's basically, I'll do it, watch, rude gesture. It's like, fuck you to the King of England. I didn't say it, I just gestured it. And in that letter, the signatories the founders, right, signed and said, these are the things that are bad. And one of them is he has incited domestic insurrection amongst our frontiers. The merciless Indian savages whose only known, I'm saying this really close, but I'm a little bit off, whose only known rule of existence is bloodthirsty destruction of all races, sexes, and killing everybody, right? So basically it's like, they're like, yeah, we got these brown people over here and they're all terrorists. So, and the king is making them, you know, get all excited. And they're gonna kill us. So he's terrible, so we need to not have a king. They also don't talk about that part of the Declaration of Independence in school a lot because you're like, that's awkward. Doesn't fit with the
I
whole.
would assume they avoid it for a reason. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like it doesn't fit with the whole. But there's it's a sort of a. They didn't have bullets, but it's a sort of a bulleted list of things of the complaints to the King of England. Check it out. It's a short. It's only like a page of text. You can see it and see the complaints. So. I a little bit lost my train of thought, but I think that the idea of othering people, right? Like this happened with indigenous people. This happened with Black people, right? And still, I think there are these vestiges of like, we think, you know, Mexican immigrants are this. We think that, you know, Black people are this. We think that that undocumented people are this. And that is a useful thing. And I mean, to get whatever, to get explicitly political or not political in terms of political parties, you know, the Trump administration has given rise. I mean, it always existed. It's not say it's like Trump didn't invent a thing, right? It's always existed in the United States, right? And it's existed much worse in times. I mean, we should remember that the United States created concentration camps to be specific, people I think times forget, for Japanese people and Japanese Americans, like many, like people who are like second, third, fourth generation Americans were put into concentration camps. We even say, we don't say concentration camps because it's awkward because the United States was at war. We're like, we're ending concentration camps and we're gonna go invade Germany. You're like, well, we have ones here too. That othering, right, makes the rest of the people feel like, oh, we know who the enemy is, right? We know who we're supposed to kill. We know who we're supposed to imprison. We know who we're supposed to execute. And that is a very simple, it's a comforting way to live in some ways, right? It's fearful, but it's comfort. You're like, I know who the enemy is. That's the bad guy. And if we get the bad guy and we just lock them up or execute them or drop a bomb on them, then everything will be okay because we just have to find all the bad guys and we do that, right? I watch a lot of movies, but there's like, people know the character, the Punisher, right?
Yes.
From Marvel Comics. It's like Punisher theory. It's like Punisher mindset or John Wayne mindset, right? Like just kill all of them. And then once we kill all of them, everyone else can live in peace and harmony. And you hear language like this, people say like real Americans or middle America, or, and what you're talking about is what that harkens to is white, Christian, straight men in nuclear families that are centrist or right-wing, right? Not other people, right? And we've seen that, you know, and you see actually even racist terms, like whenever the United States goes to war against a country, there's always a racist term to call the people you're gonna kill. So literally, I'm not gonna say those names, but I'll just list some wars. And when the United States was at war with Germany, there was a derogatory term for German people, right? Specific derogatory term for German people. When the United States was at war with, at the same time with Japan, had a specific derogatory term for Japanese people. There was a slightly different one for Korean people during the Korean War in the 50s. There was a number, there were 3 or 4 for Vietnamese, because I think because it was so long and because the United States killed so many Vietnamese people, they had several, right, for Vietnamese people. And well, actually, I'll say all Southeast Asian people, because Vietnamese, Cambodian, Laotian, and other ethnic groups like the Hmong people, there were derogatory terms because they said, we need to kill these people. We can't call them people, so we'll call them something derogatory. And we see that in society today, right? And people use terms like hood, people use terms like looter, people use terms like thug. There's really fascinating, if people are interested in, and if there are questions about it, it's actually fascinating where the word thug and the word loot come from. There are words that come from Hindi. It's really interesting because British colonists called Indian people it in this colonial regime, and we've imported the words. They're not words in the English language. They were imported from Hindi, which is fascinating to me. So it was racist to begin with. And now people say that. If I said in my mind right now, like, if don't close your eyes, but virtually close your eyes and say, you're sitting in a room, someone walks in. It's a thug looking character, a thug. I'm not going to ask you, but what does that person look like? Even if you're brown, what does that person look like? Because the media beats it into your head, right? It isn't some like white Southie kid that plays hockey. It isn't some, like Armenian kid who's in a gang in Los Angeles. There's Armenian gangs in Los Angeles. It isn't like a Russian mobster from Brooklyn. I think it's a specific thing, right? And there's a reason that happens, right? There's a reason that happens. So I think that is politically profitable, right? If you want to become, get elected, this just happened in Georgia. One of the people running for Congress who won the primary, who's almost certainly going to be a congresswoman, or is going to be a congresswoman in the new Congress in January, is this like believes these wild conspiracy theories, right? But when you do those things, and conspiracy theories obviously are based in all of this wild fear mongering, like next level fear mongering. But when you do those things, people are like, oh, that's comforting. They're bad, horrible cabal of secret people, and we're not them. And we're the good people in the movie, and they're the bad people. And if we get rid of the bad people, we win, right? That's a very easy, popular way to talk to people. Right. But that isn't the case. And I'll say this, like, if any of what I'm saying people think I'm demonizing, people in the criminal legal system, people in government, that isn't the case. I really deeply believe that there aren't bad people. There are people who do bad things, and there are people who've done a lot of bad things, and there are people who've done less, and there aren't any who haven't done any. There's none of those people, right? And one of those things is many people have said, and a lot of my mentors here in Boston, Black women say, hurt people. And when we use punitive measures, when we demonize people, and when we punish people, it's not like they're going to come out and be like, oh, I'm fine now, everything's good. I'm just going to be a productive member of society. I think that in the analogy I give in that is, if people think of their children, or if you don't have children, imagine. And, you tell your kid, I'm going to go to the store, get a newspaper. Can you still buy newspapers? I think maybe.
Yes.
For another
year.
Yes,
you can.
But you say, I tried to buy one a little while ago and I had to go to like 4 bodegas. They're like, newspaper, why would we have it? It's on the internet. So let's say, parent goes to the down the block to get a newspaper and tells the kid, you eat all the cookies, don't eat all the cookies. Just leave the cookie jar there and don't mess with it because it's a nice cookie jar. Don't mess with it. You leave the house. Kid obviously goes, eats all the cookies, breaks the cookie jar, crumbs all over his face, broken cookie jar. So you're like, good parent. So what do? You take your kid and you lock him in the closet for 3 weeks and give him a bucket, right? Everyone thinks, wow, Carl's a weird person. Why is he saying that? But that's what in many ways as a society, we do to people, right? And then we take but we do this with adults, and we do it also with young people, children. We use the word juvenile because it sounds better, but we put children in prisons. We put children in solitary confinement. But then that person comes out, right, after a year, right? So, my analogy of the kid in the closet, do you think that kid is going to be like, oh, he's going to be like, I need to not eat the cookies. I'm going to do everything mom says, going to do a lot more vacuuming around this house and make sure the trash is taken out. And I'm going to do some bathroom cleaning too. No, the kid's going to be like, I'm going to burn down this house. I hate everyone. But really, that's and with a child, we know this is the result, right? So why do we think we can put someone in solitary confinement for a year or 2 years, or even in prison or jail for a year or 2 years, and then they walk out? I've seen this happen a lot. People will walk out of, it's the county House of Corrections here in Suffolk County in Boston. And it's sort of down this like cul-de-sac, like sort of U-shaped street. And it's kind of in this industrial like corner, right? And like behind it is part of the highway system. So there's only you can only walk out of that U street. And if you're there, sometimes you'll see a person come out and you can tell that they've just been released because they'll have a clear plastic bag And it's, you know, if you've seen this in the movies where they're giving, it's in like the Blues Brothers, like they're giving him back all the things that he had with him when he's like a comb and like a 50 cents and a watch and sunglasses, I think he has. And they give you that bag. So you see people walk out on the street and they have their plastic bag. I saw one time a guy come out and he didn't even know where he was because he's like, I got arrested and they took me here underground in a truck. And like, I'm not from this part of Boston. I'm not from Boston. You know, maybe he's from a different town and he got arrested and charged with something in Boston. And he looked up the street and it was kind of snowy and there's kind of like a bunch of warehouses. And then he looked down the street and it sort of looked the same. There's some parking lots and part of the highway. And then he looked up the street again and he just didn't know what to do and he didn't have anywhere to go, right? And then he just sort of shuffled off down the street. And I'm like, the odds that that person is going to commit, I don't know who that person was. I didn't follow up. I'm not saying anything bad about them. The odds that that person is going to commit a crime that night, because he probably has nowhere to stay. He has no money. He was locked up for seemingly from what he was wearing. He was locked up in the summer and it was the winter in Boston. I'm like, if it were any of us, are you going to, you know, go to an empty parking lot and break in a car and like sleep in it because you have nowhere to go? Are you going to try to get a little time, maybe go to the convenience store and shoplift some donuts or like try to get a coffee, just drink the coffee from the dispenser? Well, they used to have coffee dispensers. Now it's COVID. You can't have that. But what is that person going to do? Right. And I think when we demonize people, when we do this, and granted, I've defended cases. I know people in my family have been victims of very violent crimes. However, if we punish people enough, we'll live in a beautiful society. If we arrest people enough, we'll live in a great, great world, which we've done that for a long time and it hasn't really worked too well. No. But if we say, actually, if we spend more money educating people, if we spend more money on having really good schools and really applied teachers that understand their communities and can communicate with people and people who do provide resources to people, that makes more sense to me.
It also makes more sense to me. All right, so one of the things that we're going to talk about is the impact of a lack of transparency in low-income communities and communities of color. One of the big things is there's a disconnect. And my question is, when it comes to that, what happens to the relationship with, we'll say others, so with the police, with the city government?
Okay, and when you're saying transparency, you're talking about transparency, correct. Government transparency. Yeah. I'm in the middle of a big thing right now. The Boston police are mad at me.
Yes,
it's on the internet. You can see it. So if anything happens to me, I didn't do it, and I wasn't driving. Anyway, I'm not going to get into that. If people have questions about it, I cannot talk about it also. But I'm going to go back to second grade. When in second grade, I learned that we're supposed to live in a democracy, and part of a democracy is we're all the government, right? That means if the mayor sends an email to someone and says, we're selling a parcel of land for a certain amount of money, or the governor says, is discussing what the COVID policies should be going forward with the director of public health. We they boss. They work for us. That isn't only like they can tell us if we want to know, if we have a good reason. It is public information. And I'll tell you, this is just to define the law. Everything the government does, from like the dog catcher to the president of the United States, everything they do is public information, except if it's not, right? So, but the burden, but this is clear, and this is a little bit of law for you. The burden is on the record holder. That means the government to say this thing, no, we're doing a secret, you know, like if, let's say Easthampton was like, there was like a murderous gang of people. Let's say it's a motorcycle gang, we'll make it cool. So they're coming in and they're like killing people and they're like dealing, knock on wood, we don't want any of this to happen. And they're dealing drugs and we're like, people are like, we're going to get someone to infiltrate the gang. So, you know, we're going to have a woman infiltrate the gang. So we got to have her buy a Harley Softail. She's got to go to training to ride it, because if you're going to infiltrate a motorcycle gang, you got to know how to ride a motorcycle. She's got to get her hair cut. So there's a budget for that. And that's happening, right? So she's going to go infiltrate the gang, pretend she's part of the gang, and then like take down the whole gang because it's a movie. But if you said, well, I want the records of all secret investigations that you're doing right now, they'd be like, no, we're not going to tell you that, because obviously we couldn't do it. So that makes sense, right? Or if you said, you know, if the United States were going to war with a country for some reasonable reason, and someone said, well, I want the military plans of, you know, let's say it was, you know, during World War II, and he said, I want the plans for the Normandy invasion. I would like to have those, send them to me. They go, no, we're not. We can have them the day after, but not the day before. Right. That makes sense because it's national security. It's an ongoing investigation. If I said, tell me everyone who works for the city of Easthampton who has HIV, the city could be like, no, because you don't have any, that's personal information and we're not giving you that. That makes sense. And I think I would agree with that. Actually, if the city did that, I'd be like, that's problematic. Don't do that. Right. But all the other stuff, like how much the mayor gets paid, right? Actually, if the mayor's here, you should just tell us how much you get paid, because it's public information and everyone should know that. Everyone should know that. If you're a police officer, everyone should know how much you get paid. Everyone should know, because some kid might be like, I want to be a police officer. I didn't know they get paid that much or that little. Or I think it would be better if we had 2 police officers and they apparently cost this much per year, right? That's public information, and we can decide how to allocate resources. We can decide what we want to do with things. And that is a piece of transparency. Also, if there are internal affairs complaints against police officers, if they're confirmed or denied, right? That should be information that's available. Generally, police reports should be made available. There are some times that they're not, if let's say a person is a child victim of a sexual assault, right? And that person doesn't, you know, want that information out in the public, that makes sense, right? There are very good reasons. And also in a smaller community, you might be able to tell because, you know, you have a location or you knew it happened at a school, and you might be able to find out. So this is what redaction is, like you can black things out, right? But generally the operations of a government should want these things to happen. They could say, we're doing a damned good job and we want to show you the PowerPoint. We want to show you the emails that we sent. We want to show you the budget that we put together. And we want to show you because our residents, our town residents, our city residents, our state residents are smart as hell. And they can look at things and say, you know what? It would be better if we did this. And when we have public hearings, the more informed people are. Like, if I was the mayor of a town, I want every person in the town to read the budget, to be as bored with the budget as I was. But that's a good thing, right? Because then you have informed consent, you have what real democracy is, and you bore the tears out of people, and you show them also the hard work that you do. I mean, writing a budget for a city is brutally difficult, right? And satisfying all parties isn't only difficult, it's completely impossible for a state government, a city government, town, or federal government. But those things should be open. And those are some things that I think this discussion could put forward, right? That documents about funding, documents about police practices and procedures, also like how police are trained, manuals about police training. I have a copy in that room over there of the Boston Police Training Manual, which I'll say, kudos to the Boston Police Department, rare for me to say, but kudos to the Boston Police Department. It's online, right? So I can just right now on my computer, I could bring it up and share screen and show you the policies and procedures of the Boston Police Department. So sometimes when I have a case or, you know, someone in the community calls me and says, oh, this happened, the police did this, can they do that? Right? So I had someone asked me a question about, there was a traumatic incident, this is a while ago, it was at a party and there was a shooting and the police detained a number of people and a woman was frisked. And the woman was frisked by someone who was not the same gender as her. And she was very upset about this, which that makes sense to me that she would be upset about it. And she said that violates their policies. I'm like, I think there's an exception for an emergency situation in the rules of the Boston Police Department. So, you know, like if there was an active shooter going on, you're not gonna be like, we need to wait and we need to get someone who matches the gender. So we're gonna wait a half an hour, but we think you're standing there with a gun and you're about to shoot people. So I looked it up. I said, here's the rule. I go, the question is, was it enough of an exception? Like, were you just walking down the street and what was the touching like? And you know, if it wasn't an active shooter situation and for some reason they believe that you had something to do with that or there was public safety, their rules allow for that. And she was like, oh, and I sent her the rule. I sent her the link and I said, you can read this. You can disagree with it. And that's fine. You could send a letter to the Boston Police Department. You could write to your city councilor and say, I don't think that that's cool. You shouldn't do it. You might have to have a better suggestion in mind. But she was like really satisfied. She's like, oh, I didn't know that. I just thought they couldn't do it. And I said, well, you see what they're purporting, what the reason is, right? And she goes, yeah, I guess that could make sense, but it wasn't that, and I can't remember exactly, but she was like, it wasn't that much of an emergency. I said, okay, yeah, I mean, you could file a complaint about that if you wanted to, but now you see that there is a rule about it. And she goes, yeah, and I understand that. So that's you know, and the town police department certainly has a big old thick manual of policies and procedures that is useful, right? You can see what their use of force policy is, you know, when are they supposed to use so-called less than lethal, when can they use firearms, when can they use batons, when can they use tasers, do they use tasers, do they have peppers or Aurelia capsicum, so-called pepper spray, do they have, you know, they have these like, you know, projectile guns that shoot pepper balls, like do they have those, do they have training for those, do they need to go to training for those? That's good stuff to know, right? It's good stuff to know. It's also good because you can see, are police doing what they're supposed to do, or are they not? Or are the rules good? Like, should you change those rules? Should you suggest changes to those rules? In Boston right now, there's a, you know, some city legislation about banning the use of chokeholds. I have a whole bunch of thoughts about that, but that's, you know, going forward. There's also some stuff that's, they're not using the word banning, but it's very strongly restricting the use of tear gas and Aurelium capsicum spray, or what people call pepper spray, OC spray, oleoresin resin capsicum. So those are things that we should know, right? And if we're moving in this space, I think it makes sense to, you know, at least some of the stuff is like what uniform, like how many patches a police are and where the flag should be on the uniform. It's like, okay, but do what you need to do. But some of it is like, when can you shoot somebody? It doesn't say it that way, but there's the, you know, the triangle that says the escalation of force. You should know that. If you live in a community where there are questions about policing, it might behoove you, if you have children, if you're going to school, if people have been stopped by the police, it makes sense to know that, right? Because then if you're stopped by police, you can ask a question. You can say, hey, did I do something? Or do you believe I have a weapon? Whatever it is. So I think those are things that we can always make advances. Government can always make advances, and community can be partners in that and ask for things.
Absolutely. Okay, so we're going to move on to the question and answers. This is the fun part for me. And again, we covered a lot of different topics today. So if you feel like you've already answered this question, you don't have to answer it. So we have a question where it says, when there is an organization for change against imbalance of power, fear and mistrust seem to be stoked. We see people, especially white women, using statements like radical, or I'm afraid of you, or I'm going to be calling the police, to stop dialogue and to instill fear. Is this situation something you're familiar with?
Yeah. I had some neighbors, they were Northeastern students, props to Northeastern, like Northeastern students are great in general, but some Northeastern students once called, this is while I was a civil rights lawyer, they called the police on me because they didn't like where I was parked. And I was like, my car is parked in front of my house. I've lived here for 20 years. It's parked legally. I don't know. He's like, he just yelled at me. He's like, move your car. It's in my way. And I was like, first of all, if you want me to do something, you should ask me. Second of all, I don't know about this commanding language. So he called the police, and the police came to my house and said, is this your car? I said, yeah, it's my car. They were like, I said, yeah, but let me explain. And he's like, no, you need to move your car. And I was like, what? It's parked legally. He's like, we're going to tow it. And I'm like, I don't really think you can tow my car. I'm actually certain you can. But the reason I tell this story is not to besmirch the officer but it's that this is a person half my age, right? Like, it's like 18-year-old at the time, this is a while ago, if you're doing the math, like half my age, and saying, I'm going to call the police on you. And I'm like, I'm a lawyer. I've lived here for 20 years. My car's parked legally. Like, what are you talking about? Like, what? I was just apoplectic about the idea that you're going to call the police. But the thing is, he understands the racialized dynamic, right? So it's a white kid from Maine who goes like, if I call the police, they're going to believe me. right? Which is wild because I mean, I work in Roxbury Court, I work in Dorchester Court, I do, you know, like I'm litigating murder cases in Suffolk Superior Court in Boston. And those places, I would think like, I might be familiar with the officers, right? When they come, wasn't the case. And then I sort of got assaulted by a police officer who tried to pull me downstairs by my neck and then ran in my house without a search warrant, which is not legal. But those things, we see these things because we live in a society where we're taught, right, that it probably is not going to go so well for you if you're a person of color, if you're a poor person, if you're Black, brown, Indigenous, and you get an interaction with the police, especially in people say inner city, but like in the hood, right? Like if that happens in the hood, there are going to be questions asked. There's going to be assumptions made, right? And in that case, there were questions asked and there were assumptions made, right? But I think I benefited from that because of differently, because there are ways I benefit from male privilege. There are ways I don't benefit from like race privilege. There are ways that I think my class standing or my perceived class standing like sort of protects me, right? And I think that the officer sort of got nervous when he was like, because he was standing in my house and he was like, he's like, maybe this isn't exactly what I expected. And then when I was speaking to him, he was like, yeah, maybe this isn't what I expected. And then another officer came and said, you need to not be in this person's house.
Right.
But I think in the system, I mean, we've seen this, right? Like Becky's, Karen's, I think are terms that people use, and that people know or believe that police will take their side if they're on the right side, the white side of the race line. Like people, there's a belief in that, right? And is that true often in society? Yeah, I think it's true frequently in society, right? Because I mean, I could go through a list.
It's common. Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. So we're going into a question and answer period. And I would like to remind everybody, if you have any questions, to raise your hand, be respectful and be courteous to our wonderful guest. Display your name, make sure your camera's on. Please be present. Take care of your needs. Commit to learning, all the wonderful things. But during the question and answer period, I stress to please have your name and video on. Please take no more than 1 minute to ask a question and do not simply make statements. And let's no questions?
Wow.
Anyone? No one? Really? Kind of surprised.
Hi, my name is Gwen.
Oh, hi, Gwen.
How are you?
Good, good. What is your
Good.
question today?
I have a question. It's just something I see or that I've observed by living in the hood, is that a lot of people don't know what their rights are. They have no idea of any other way of life, especially if they've been living for generations in the same place and they haven't been able to be out in the world. They don't know the difference. And so that kind of ties in with transparency as well. So how can people who women, Black, Indigenous, so many have been kept down their entire lives. They just don't know their rights or how to navigate around in the world outside of that place, that position that they're in. So I wonder if anyone has any insight about that.
I do, because I talk a lot. No. So I have done these so-called know your rights trainings for a very long time. I've probably done hundreds of them to many thousands. Like one time I did it, it was 1,000 people. So I know it's been more than 1,000 people because in one shot it was 1,000. So I'm going to disagree with you in a way, but see if you agree with me about this. I think my camera keeps like defocusing. I think people do, like, when there's a boot, metaphorically, when there's a boot on your neck, you're like, this is bad and this shouldn't be on my neck. You might not be able to say this is a violation of my Fourth Amendment rights in the 14th Amendment of the Massachusetts Constitution, Declaration of Man. Point in case, excessive use of force, and I'm being detained. Illegal, right? You might not say that, but you're like, this is effing wrong. Like, this should not be happening, right? And when, as for gender, when, you know, someone's at work and every time you go into the copy room, someone's like, hey, toots, looks good, looks, oh man, like that, like them pants, they're real tight. And you're like, sorry if that triggered anyone, but really, but someone's like, you're a disgusting pig, stop talking, I hate him, I hate going into the copy room, I can't stand this, but I need this job, right? You might not know that that's actionable because part of your job is to photocopy things, part of your job is to print things, and you must go in that room. Because that person is not your superior in any way, but because they are in that room and they are blocking you with sexualized harassment to complete your job, that is actionable. You can sue for that, right? You might not know that. You know that that guy's a jerk and he's doing something he shouldn't do and he's wrong, right? So I think one of the things is but then the other thing, so that's part of it. I think really when people are oppressed and are wronged, they know it's wrong, but they sort of, it's like, what can I do about it? Then there's a diversion, because a lot of times, you know, me as a man, me as someone who has some access to capital, like, and wealth, and I have educational, like they put a bunch of words in my head for education for a long time. I have some ways to, like, you know, fight that. But some people don't have a way to fight it. So some people will say, you know, it's easy for me to come along and be like, oh, you can file a 1983 civil rights complaint against that police officer and sue them in federal court. And they're like, yeah, sure, I can. How is that exactly going to work? Isn't there like a $600 filing fee? And wouldn't I need to spend, we did a case in Worcester. It took 8 years it was a very simple case. The police officer like tackled someone, threw her down, like her earring ripped from her ear, her shoulder dislocated. The whole thing was on video because her sister was speeding in a car, allegedly. It took like 7 years, and a full trial, a full federal court trial, which took like 5 days. It's like the average person has no access to that. So when I tell someone you have the right to bodily integrity, to not be illegally searched by police, to not be excessive force by police, they go, and this has happened to me, they go, so what? What am I, even if they do that to me, what am I going to do, Carl? What am I going to do? I'm going to go to federal court. I'm going to sue them. Who's going to believe me, first of all? Second of all, I can't do that. I don't have the resources of, you know, a large nonprofit to litigate a case for 6 years, right? So one is what people's rights are, but then there's what actually happens, right? Because in Boston, you know, 100,000 people we had you can see the Boston Police Department, the stop and frisk report that the ACLU did, and hundreds of thousands of people were stopped, frisked on scant, if any, evidence, right? Can all of those people sue? And if you ask me, can all of those people sue and win and have that be a useful use of their time? The answer to that question is absolutely not. No way, right? So the question is, when you know that, when I tell you it is a violation of your Fourth Amendment rights, it is a violation of your Fifth Amendment rights, it is a violation of, you know, Sixth Amendment rights, right? You know, someone who's educated person on the street, like street educated person, will be like, so the F what? So what? Like, what am I going to do about it? Right? Or the woman who's being sexually harassed is like, but they're going to fire me. And am I going to sue them? And am I going to win? And then I live in a small town. Where am I going to work?
Right.
Right. And I guess that many, 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 many thousands of people have experienced that, right? I would say, you know, women in workplace, Black and brown folks in communities, LGBTQ folks, certainly, like trans women have experienced that, you know, everywhere, right? So anyway, there's a sort of a dichotomy. And one thing I'll just say in the end of it is, I think sometimes we want to think that if we give the oppressed person a specific piece of information, they will no longer be oppressed. And forgive me for this, I'm going to use a gendered example of this, which is, I think it's distinct, but it's also a little bit problematic. It's like if women are sexually assaulted and I come in and I'll be like, hey, here, you're being sexually assaulted. Let me explain to you about sexual assault. They should like hit me in the head a little bit and be like, I understand it far better than you, Mr. Man. Don't explain it to me. And And there's not a magical solution to that, right? There isn't a magical solution to like someone who's a victim of domestic violence. There isn't a magical solution to sexual harassment. There isn't a magical solution to, racialized oppression, right? Well, there is a magical solution. It's called organizing. Like we organize, we fight back, we put pressure on those systems, and we fight heteropatriarchy, we fight, white supremacy and systemic racism and classism in our communities. And it's a long, hard fight, but we win when we fight.
Definitely. I'd like to believe so anyway. Do we have any more questions from anyone? All right. How you doing? We're good?
Yeah, I'm good.
All right, good.
I have tea, so I'm good.
Even better. I love tea. All right, so we have some more questions. When city officials or elected officials don't hold themselves accountable for racist or classist behavior. Now, this is a three-part question. You can answer it however you'd like. What does it say to the community that they're representing? How is it harmful? And what is the impact of implicit bias? And why is it simply having training on implicit bias not enough? I know, that's a lot.
So the first part I'm going to skip over and just say, organized communities can, and what I mean by that is people in city, town, in Boston, like in sub communities, if we organize to stand up for our rights and we demand more from our elected officials, right? I think we get more. And also sometimes it's not, elected officials don't solve all the problems, like, and they're not going to do all the problem solving. Like much of it can just be done by people, right? Much of it can just be done by people, right? So here in Boston, there's a mutual aid group that has been feeding people during COVID since the start of the pandemic, right? And if you live in Roxborough, Dorchester, you can call this line and say, I need 5 meals delivered for lunch and 5 meals for dinner. And a car will pull up to your house, leave a bag in your porch, and call you and say that the food is there, right? Government, has nothing to do with that. And I'll say, actually, also on food, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense in Oakland started a free breakfast program for children, because children would go to school and they would be dizzy and they would have headaches because they didn't eat any food because they were very, very, very poor. And they said, kids should have food and we can make pancakes really cheap. So they got donations, they started kitchens, they made food for kids. And everything, it was great. And they did political education. Many of those children today are, like very, very productive members. Not that being productive member of society is important, but do good things and live happy, satisfied lives in Oakland and across the country. Then the government was like, oh, they give kids food? Well, and they're not even a government. And if you went to school and you had a school lunch program in your school, the reason that you had a school lunch program is because the Black Panthers did it, and governments were kind of like, municipal governments were like, that's kind of embarrassing that they're doing it and we're not. And that's where school lunches came from. And I was a school lunch kid. Like the
I was
school I
also
went to,
a school lunch kid.
yeah, if you got free school lunch, it meant you were poor. And I grew up in like different things because my mother died when I was young. So like I grew up in sort of different classes because I got passed around a little bit, my brother and I. So at times I was, not particularly, I was never wealthy, but like my class background changed, but I always got school lunch, right? And I remember kids going like, you got the plastic tray. That means you're poor. But I was like, the ravioli, it was good. And the pizza was nasty, but the pizza was good. And I used to like chocolate milk, although chocolate milk's nasty. But those things, I think, in terms of accountability, I think there are many, many, many ways to do that, right? We can demand things from government. We can push government to do things. We can suggest at times that government do things. And at other times, we can take what our more anarchist friends call direct action, right? We can just say, we're not going to wait for it, right? We're going to provide, right? Folks did this in Worcester. They were going around to homeless communities and they were making hand sanitizer. They were making hand wash kits. They were giving packs of masks, and they bagged up many thousands of them. And they were going around to the homeless and unhoused community. And they would be like, hey man, do you want $1? Because the person would be like, oh, and then they would be like, here, and I want to give you this too. And they would give them a kit. And this is just the organizer in me in my heart. That's my dear friend of mine, Chris Robarge, an organizer in Worcester. They were doing that. And I know a little tiny bit about public health, and I know some people who study public health. There are almost certainly people who are alive now because that happened, right? Because someone might've got the virus, they might've passed it to someone else, they might've passed it because they're vector points, and no one will ever know. But if you stopped 20 people from getting symptomatic or asymptomatic COVID, and then what those people would have passed it to, and what those people would have passed it to, and what those people would have passed it to, there are people alive because people just said, we're not going to wait for anybody to do anything. We're not going to do a protest. We're just going to be out in these streets and providing things for our community. And that is like, it brings a tear to my eye to think like, that's amazing, right? And then sometimes the government's like, ooh, you're doing a good thing. And actually that, I think later that did happen with the mutual aid, the food programs here in Boston. I think I'm not sure if it was like the Boston Foundation or some nonprofits that some get government-related funding decided like we should give money to this, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think
that's super important.
Yeah, and then I think there's a much more traditional thing to say, you should vote this way on this thing. You should pass this ordinance.
Right.
Like the city of Boston right now is struggling with whether they're going to put very, very strict limitations on the use of war munition. I don't know what to call them, but chemical weapons, oleoresin resin capsicum, OC spray, and tear gas.
That's crazy. We have a question from Yaping.
Oh, hi. First of all, thank
Hello.
you so much to AKINE for organizing this. This is so helpful. Thank you. I was wondering if you had examples from your experience in Boston of sort of city officials, ways that the government has had chances to enact change, but has given the response of we need to study this more, or gone for reform when that actually hasn't been effective. I think in Western Mass, some advocates and community groups have asked for changes, but been met with, we need more study and or reforms. And yeah, I'm wondering if you have seen that where you are.
Said briefly, it's like, have you done things that you failed into doing? So yes, I failed a lot, and people I know have failed a lot. Not to say anything bad about them, but so I mean, much more often than not, like, we've asked for things, demanded things, requested things be changed, and we're like, we didn't get what we wanted, right? Much more often than not. Right, that's currently the case with the use of tear gas in Boston, right? Tear gas is a pretty horrible thing that can kill people, and it's also like a thing you use in wars. So I think, and right now in Boston, there's a police reform commission that is being nice. Nothing has happened. Nothing has happened. And there are other people who are like, we have this list of demands. Here it is. Here's the list. This is the list that it's the Muslim groups in Boston, the Arab groups in Boston, the Black groups in Boston, the Somali immigrant groups in Boston, all the Latinx organizations, all the youth activist organizations. It's like everybody that's in the streets. It's all the people, right? And then the police practices commission, right, is like, we have this list. And we're like, that list is not the same as this list, right? And also that list hasn't even been implemented. They're going really, really, really slow with the very institutional group, right? But the other group is like, we are demanding these things, right? They're very, very specific things. One of them was a 10% cut in the Boston Police Department budget, which is enormous. It's like getting close to $500 million.
Ooh.
$500 million. Actually, I should be fair. It's like 400 in all. It's 400. But there are some hidden things because like the school police budget is a separate budget, and then the overtime budget is a separate budget. And if you get to it, if you put all the money at the end of the year, the amount that is spent on policing in Boston is $500 million. Not counting some of the other like the T police and state police, like just Boston Police Department and related entities. It's $500 million, which that could be a lot of schools. A lot.
Yeah.
Even if you only say 10% of it, that's an enormous number of schools. I mean, it's $50 million. How many schools could you build in 1 year? Right. And that's also if you did that every year. So that was the demand. But then the other thing was like, we're going to institute a plan to study whether there should be a police civilian review board, which there already is a thing called the co-op board, but now they're going to restudy the co-op thing to see what should be implemented. Although there's already an academic study, which is the most comprehensive academic study that I'm aware that was ever done about every possible form of police oversight committee. It's like, there's already a document, it's on Northeastern's website, it's like 70 pages long. I don't know how you could be more comprehensive than that. Like, unless it had the names of streets in Boston. I don't know how more specific you can get. So they're like, we have to study this. And I'm like, what are you going to do? Read the paper? Like, you could do that. And they have an overview. It's like a 2-page thing. You can read it right now. I knew because I went on some show and they wanted me to talk about it. I was like, oh, it's 70 pages. I'm like, let me just read the overview. I'm like, okay, I got it. I got what it is. And that is frustrating. Sometimes it's understandable because, you have counselors, you have committee members, you have state representatives, you have mayors and governors who are like, look, I have a lot of, like, the police are going to have concerns about this. The fire department is going to have concerns about this. EMS is going to have concerns about this. The state police and their family and friends and supporters are going to have concerns about this. The, people fighting for racial justice, they're going to have concerns about this. So how do I balance it, right? Like, how do I, like, where's the middle line for this? How do I, make this happen? And what does that administration or that individual or that body want to do? So I think sometimes it's, I'm avoiding using the term disingenuous. Sometimes clearly there are people who do it in a disingenuous way. Sometimes it completely makes sense. And how do you tell the difference? I don't know. You try to tell the difference. And but the thing I think I find really useful is if you make demands, some initial demands that show trust, that are more directly, they're subject to sort of direct compliance, right? Like asking for documents, you can be like, look, we want these documents. We want these pieces of paper. We want this information, right?
We have another question from Rye.
Hello.
What's up?
Can you hear me? I have audio troubles a lot.
We can hear you.
Great. First, I want to thank AKINE. And then also, I'm calling in. Well, I'm watching from Northampton, which is nearby. And Northampton currently has a police review commission. And I've been attending some of those meetings. And one of the things the review commission is talking about is creating a new department in Northampton that is not the police department, is not necessarily the health department. It is a department for community safety. It's meant to house alternatives to policing that can help people that are not currently helped by the police department. And I wanted to ask if you think that's important, why you think that's important, and also how to make a department like that accountable to the people harmed by policing.
I think devil's in the details on that, right? Like, but I think it's amazing because one of the things actually police agree with people, fighting for racial justice, Black liberation, and the like. That like the police are like, we have to do this, and we're not social workers, and we're not drug counselors, and we're not EMS. And I'm like, yeah, I agree. So we should spend more money on some of those things. But here in Boston, and I think across the state, if you call for an ambulance, if someone like, knock on wood, has a heart attack or anaphylactic shock and drops down at your house, and you call EMS, if you call for an ambulance, police come with the ambulance, right? I don't have statistics on that, so I'm not going to say a number, but I'm going to guess a pretty large percentage of the time that's not necessary, right? If someone calls and says, I'm being beaten in a domestic violence and I'm bleeding and I need stitches and I'm locked in the bathroom, it's like, okay, that's a much different situation, right? But if someone is like, I'll say a real one, my mother just fell down. This is, this happened to someone I know. They were like, the mother had an epileptic seizure, right? And I think might have hit her head and became unconscious for an ambulance. And like 8 cops came. And you're like, what, why are there 8 cops here? Like, for what reason? Like, if there was any threat of anything, like the person could have said, I'm here and there's a guy that's going to rob us too. I don't know how you would, in that situation, how you would need cops for anything, but there's not even an imaginable scenario where my relative just fell down because they had a seizure. We need an ambulance, right? And much of policing is this, is like people responding to, you know, things that do not require armed people, right? A very, like if I were to ask, I'm not going to ask, but people's encounters with police on this phone call, people would be like, I got a ticket, right? I got a ticket. I'm not really going to harp on like, there are ways to do that. I mean, if you're in France and you get a speeding ticket, it's because a camera took a picture of your license plate when you went by it on the highway, right? Like they don't even have that as it is in the United States, right? But there are ways, I don't want a whole bunch of cameras in people's speeding tickets because I'd get a bunch. But there are ways to deal with things that don't require armed actor, like paramilitary actors of the state with arrest powers to solve those problems. And that's one of those is sick people, right? Like how does sick people amount to that? And granted, like if it arises to that occasion, maybe there's a way to request that, to say differently, we can request this. So I think that is a win-win, except for people who just like want more money for policing, which like want to build the police empire to be like, no, we want more money and more money and more money. I think it's hard to be against that, to say like, also like EMS people and social workers get paid less generally than cops. So you can hire like 2 for, I don't know, it's not 2 for 1, but you can hire more of those people. And I mean, especially how is that not in the current environment in the United States? I think there's barely ever been a time where it's more, society is more amenable to the argument to have, you know, social workers, healthcare workers, mental health workers, people who are struggling, you know, with substance abuse disorder. It's a great time for that, right? It's a great time to say we should spend money on that.
Absolutely. Imagine what we could do with $500 billion.
And I always say it's every year, like it's every year they spend that. I mean, imagine if you had, you know, I'm old again, but there's the Betty Ford Center. I don't even know if that still exists. It's a very fancy drug rehab place. Imagine there was like a super fancy drug rehab hospital that was just free. You could just walk in. Got a jacuzzi, pool, sauna. People drug rehab place. They got the best food. You're like, good. We want you there. We want you there.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'll say, like, you know, I have, you know, family members who, you know, struggled for years with, you know, addiction to heroin, and ultimately some that it took that ultimately, you know, indirectly took their lives. And they're not bad people, right? None of them are bad people. And had there been a bunch of money spent on that instead of money spent on policing or other things in society, I don't know. I don't like the what if thing, but like I might have some relatives and immediate relatives, like, and this is including my mother, would be alive now.
Absolutely.
And it makes
Okay, so we have,
it makes me mad. It makes me sad.
I'm sorry. It makes us all mad. We have one more question. So our chief of police often refers to the police budget as their money. Why do police departments make it difficult to access information about their budget and salaries if they are paid with taxpayer money? And the second part of that question is, why are police held to a different standard and accountability when they're paid by public funds? And why is holding them to a different standard dangerous for everybody in the community?
You mean a different standard in relation to the funds?
Correct.
Okay. First, I'm gonna yell at you. It doesn't matter that you're a taxpayer. It doesn't matter that you're a taxpayer that you get to know that information. If you're a homeless person on the street and you never paid a tax in your life and you say, I want to know how much the chief of police makes, I want to know how much the mayor makes. No difference. Actually, that person should know more because they're struggling more and they deserve to know. If a person's 8 years old and they're like, as a part of their homework assignment, because they got a great teacher, says you're writing a public records request to the city council and asking every one of them to tell you how much money they make. And that kid's never paid a tax in their life. They only get money, right? And and their parents get welfare. Hasn't paid any taxes. That person still has a right to know. So when people, sometimes I just push on this, when people say we're citizens, we have a right to know, or we're taxpayers and we have a right to know. No, we're here and we have a right to know. If someone just came here from Mexico and they don't even have any document, they don't have documentation and they don't speak English and they write a letter in Spanish and they've never paid taxes and they say, I want to know. They have a right to know. They have a right to know those things. The same way as they have a right not to be beat up by the police. They have a right to know those things, right? So I just take issue of as being a taxpayer. You don't get.
Yes, that's fine. That's fine.
You shouldn't get extra rights just because you pay taxes. That's not how it works. And I don't think you think it, but I think a lot of times we say that. So when people say citizen or taxpayer, I'm always like, like they're like, I shouldn't be beat up by the police because I'm a citizen. I'm like,
Yeah.
but the non-citizen should. Sorry, that's the lawyer parsing.
Right. No.
But,
yeah.
But if you guys know a lawyer, here's the thing: public records requests. Some people think they're these in FOIA requests. People think they're these super formal. You could do it right now. Stop listening to me. Type in your computer. There's a website. It's called iFOIA. I can't remember if it's .org or .com, but it's iFOIA, like iPhone, but iFOIA. FOIA. FOIA is Freedom of Information Act. Freedom of Information Act is the federal law. In Massachusetts, there's public records law. They're sort of the analogous things. You can just go on that website, you fill out a form and you say, I want records from this thing. And it has a lot of built-in addresses. It just goes click, click, click. It writes a letter for you. And you say, I want to know the salary of every police officer in the city of Boston. That already exists. You can actually go on a website because someone made a website after they did a bunch of public records requests, and you can see every single police officer in the city of Boston, how much they get paid, how much overtime they got paid, and the split of all that, every single one. And you can list it by highest paid, which is like $350,000 to lowest paid. So that is public information. If they say no, you can appeal it to the Secretary of the Commonwealth. The person who works for the Secretary of the Commonwealth, who does the appeals, is very good about public records and she believes in what she does. Props to her. And she will tell them what she was like, you didn't give this to them? You need to give it to them and you have 10 days. And if they don't do that, then you can go to federal court and you can sue them. And if they do not give it to you, they have to pay all of your costs for the time that you spent trying to get that.
Good to know.
And the person not giving it will lose. Unless there are many exceptions, right? So, and the three major ones are ongoing investigation, personal information. Like if you said, what is the reason, this person went out on sick leave, what was the medical reason? They're going to be like, no, we're not telling you that, right? But if you say, how many sick days did Carl Williams take when he was a public defender? You could find that out. You could ask the state and they would have to tell you that. I think it's none. I'm going to tell you, but that, and also you could, right now you can go online because people have done public records requests. When I was a public defender, you can see how much I got paid every year from whatever, 2008 to 2013. You could see how much I got paid every single year, and you should.
That's good to know for all of us. Does anybody have any more questions before the end of this? I think Peg had her hand raised. Anybody? Peg, did you have your hand raised?
I did. I'm trying to get my camera on, but I'm
No
having technical
worries.
difficulties. There we go. So, and this kind of goes back, Carl. And first of all, thank you so much. This has been an amazing session. So I thank you for that. This goes back to, I think it was a question Rye asked around the work going on in Northampton, and what you may or may not know is that this area that we live in is heavily occupied by therapists. There's a lot of therapists in this area, but there's not enough. And so as a member of the evil elected group in Easthampton that I am, I struggle with how to bridge the gap, because I completely agree. We've got to get the police out of the situations that have nothing to do with what they need to be doing and more in terms of mental health. But because, the population of mental health providers is just not there. And I have someone in my own family who's mentally ill and they can't get services. So I struggle with how to create policy and how to create change between augmenting the police with mental health professionals, have you seen a model that worked, and how did they get there from the existing model, the traditional model of the police going to every call for all things?
So it's very new. I'll say it's very new that's happening. But I'll say in smaller towns, it's more common, right? Because I'm avoiding referencing like 1960s sitcoms, but like, you know, people in a smaller community, people are like, oh, this person called, they're ill. We know what needs to happen, right? Like they passed out again. We have to have someone, an ambulance go out. And when it's a much smaller community, people historically sort of knew that. I think it is certainly racialized, right? Because my guess is that if we were in Lexington, right, wealthy, mostly white, very wealthy, mostly white community, right, north of Boston, I would think if we said how many police respond, how many times, what's the percentage of time police respond, and what's the amount of police respond to a call, which is like an illness or a medical concern, I would think that would be less than, it would be far less than in the hood in Boston, in Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan. So one of the things I think is a sort of a test balloon is, you know, people can set up situations where there are, I mean, they have this anyway, like, you know, if the police say there's a barricaded shooter in a house, they're like, okay, and different police have different codes for it, but like, this is a certain code, right? So certain types of police have to respond in certain ways, right? If they say it's a domestic violence between two brothers, they're like, oh, okay, less, like SWAT isn't coming in with shields, right? And they're not going to be armored trucks, unless they're very bad brothers. But I think if there were systems to put in place, and places have been doing this, I don't have a list in front of me, but some folks in Chicago have put together some lists of, they're not doing it in Chicago, but they have some lists of examples of that. And I could try to find that for you all. If you say like, look, this is a situation where someone is having a mental health problem. That's big. Like, what does that mean, right? Does it mean someone didn't take their medication? Does it mean someone, you know, had some kind of attack and then, you know, is like lying like nearly comatose, you know, in their front hallway? Or is it someone like, is it, you know, barricading themselves in the house, screaming and like throwing bottles, right? Like those are very different things. But I think being able to categorize them to say, need people with weapons, don't need people with weapons, that's a huge change. That right there is a gigantic change, right? And I think building on that, the success of what that will lead to will allow further advances. Because I think these things will happen slowly, right? Because people are like, you call the cops come. You call the cops come. You call 911, that's their number everywhere. You call the cops come. And I think sort of weaning ourselves from that will take a while, right? And it will also take people to feel comfortable to be like, oh, this thing happened and it was a much better result. And I'll also say very, very, very frequently, I know this from criminal defense because it's always tragic to me, but really frequently, like undocumented people, people with warrants, people who are Black in general, people who think they might have a warrant, right? Don't call or people who might be like living somewhere they're not supposed to live because they're not on the lease or they're not supposed to be living in those housing projects. They don't call the police because they're like, I'm not going to call the police because I'm going to get kicked out or I'm going to get deported, right? And so what you have is situations where because, or the same thing with an ambulance. Some people are like, I'm not going to call an ambulance because if I call an ambulance, then the police are going to come. And if the police come, I'm going to get arrested, deported, taken in on my warrant, thrown out of my house, whatever. So you have, especially in domestic situations, continuing crime that happens or continuing harm that happens, or even death, like if someone overdoses or something. People don't call because they know if let's say it's a 1 to 10, they were like, this is a thing that always allows. Now we don't have 1 to 10. It's just like always police. So I think if there were a way for police emergency services to assess something, which this happens anyway, but it just, there isn't a no police button. And I think that certainly could happen. And, you know, in the beginning, it could default to like, well, mostly police, right? And then the other thing is, I think there's sometimes, and we don't know this, I've just listened to a lot of 911 calls. There's a lot of times where they're not units that respond. There are not units that respond. Like someone calls and they say, this is a situation. And people say, well, that's not a crime, or, well, we're not going to do anything about that, right? Someone says like, whatever, I don't know, the cat's on my tree, or like, I think my neighbor, you know, cut my tree down in my backyard. And police like, yeah, we're not coming. Okay, we're not, that's not a thing, right? Like call your insurance company or call somebody else. We're not coming. And that happens a lot, right? So I think the vetting as to police or not police it would also behoove the police, because you could say, well, you know, then we have more resources for things that the police feel are important to investigate, right? So I don't know if that super answers, but definitely like you can look into the Chicago, I know her name, but it's Miriam Kaba is this incredible organizer in Chicago and visionary person and writer. But you can find her. I know that on her website, social media, she has some of those resources. So she has a fairly unique name. She's the only Miriam Kaba that I've ever heard of. But if you look up Miriam Kaba on the internet, you can get it. Or if you email me, I could certainly find it. Her last name is Kaba.
Perfect. Carl, thank you. You're awesome. We have one last question. So just one more, and I swear. Liz?
Oh. Hi, Carl. This actually comes from, oh, thank you for being here, by the way. This question actually comes from the Facebook chat section from Wendy Foxman. And they ask, if you were elected mayor of a major city, what would you do reforming, reducing the police department?
I wouldn't be elected mayor, not because I wouldn't get the votes, but I don't want to have an elected position. Just my personal politic. I think it's actually what we just said. What we're talking about Northampton. I would use things to wean ourselves from punitive solutions to our problems, if that makes sense, right? So saying we need to put people in jail, right? And you know, some so-called progressive district attorneys have been doing this, saying like, we don't need to arrest people for trespassing or disorderly conduct or disturbing the peace or driving on a suspended license, right? Like police departments spend an enormous amount of money arresting people for driving on a suspended license. You're like, just don't drive your car. We're giving you a ticket. Stop driving your car. And like, if you think you arrest the person, you have to get a van, you have to transport them back to the police station. If they're in the police station, then you have to have more people in the police station than you arrested, because you can't have, you know, you can't arrest 50 people and there's one guy or one woman at 3 o'clock in the morning in the police station, because that could be dangerous, right? At least in the police view of things. So people spend enormous amounts of money arresting people for really things that people don't even think are crimes, right? Like driving without proper insurance. It's a criminal offense in Massachusetts. You're like, and I've had people charged with that crime, and you're like, we arrested this person, booked them, transported them to the police station, towed their car, transported them from the police station to the courthouse, assigned them a public defender, went in front of a judge, spent time in front of a judge who's getting paid a lot of money, had a prosecutor come out. You're like, and then ultimately the case, like the person pays $200 fine, which is also, you're paying a $200 fine because you can't pay your insurance. Why don't you just let them buy insurance? Because it would be less. I think I would say, look, we're not enforcing any of that stuff. That's not important. We're just making poor people poorer, right? So stop doing that, right? And let's direct some of those resources into more healthful things. Let's take some money away from the police budget. If it were right now, I'll take the question as being right now. I would say we're going to do so much to save our population in Boston. One of the things I'm going to say, I'm going to take $500,000 and I'm going to buy masks. And every person, no matter how you ask, everyone's going to get one. We're going to put a 100 pack in everyone's house, right? We're going to tell people how to use them. We're going to have multilingual training for that. We're going to use money from the police department for that. We're going to use money from the police department for that, and for all the things that we're not, all the laws that we're not enforcing, the minor infractions. We're going to use save that money to address COVID things. And I think when you do things like that, then the communities feel like, wow, you know, my grandma had masks. I hear people in New York are dying, but like everyone here has a mask and everyone's wearing a mask, right? When you start doing that, you start seeing very, very positive effects. And people say like, you know, I kind of trust the city, like the city knows what they're doing, right? And I think that's hard when you have, you know, when people are having their neighbors like stopped and frisked in the street, right? That needs to stop, right? They need to stop doing, the police need to stop, I would make the police stop doing drug rips, right? So a drug rip is like, you know, you go up, you get someone to like go up and pretend they're, you know, they're a person dealing with substance abuse disorder, and then you arrest someone who's selling drugs in the street, right? It's like, this is important for what reason? Because you're going to stop people from buying drugs? I can right now, I can go buy drugs easier than I can go buy alcohol on the street right now. I wouldn't even need to put a jacket on because I wouldn't get that cold, right? And you think you're going to arrest enough people like so people can't buy drugs? Like, in what world is that going to happen? So the enforcement of those laws are ridiculous, and it's just a waste of time, right? And generally, you're arresting people who are dealing with substance abuse disorder because they're selling drugs to fuel their own possession of drugs. And also, when you go to jail, you can buy drugs in jail too. So that enforcement is just a waste of time. It's a waste of money. It brutalizes our people. Also here in Boston, there's a place like right off the highway where a lot of people who are dealing with substance abuse disorder congregate because there are services there, there's hospitals there, there's a methadone program there, and the police just harass them, attack them, arrest them, destroy their wheelchairs in garbage trucks. That happened. There's photos of that. And chase them away. Every day they do this, and they spend enormous amounts of money doing it. And it's just preposterous. It's like, I see cops there. I'm like, there's a cop just sitting, 2 cops in a big SUV sitting there every single day. And so many of the things that I think could massively, well, not massively, but start to improve the conditions for folks in our communities are just stop doing some bad things, right? It's not even spend money. It's just stop doing the bad things you're doing. Stopping frisking, you know, 14, 15, 16-year-old kids, you know, in the parks in our communities. So those are some. And also last thing is they keep gang databases. A lot of them are just like, this kid lives in this neighborhood and he hangs around with these people, so he must be a Wendover Street, he must be Orchard Park, he must be, you know, such and such a gang, which is ridiculous. You can never not be a gang member. You can never be like, I'm petitioning the police to make me not a gang member, even though I'm 40 years old and like that was 20 years ago. So whenever those people are stopped, they're always treated, you know, as criminal, as always suspect. Even when they're driving cars, when you run their license plates, police need to stop doing that gang database tracking.
Agreed.
Those are a few.
We have one more question from Myra.
Okay.
Hello.
I didn't want to extend. Hi, Carl. Hello.
Hey.
Okay. So my question was, and I'm still formulating it in my mind, so pardon me. I guess I just wanted to hear, as one of the last questions, what words and what words of encouragement you can have for other groups, such as AKINE, as well as other groups that may be on the call, or those people who are interested in transformation of policing, transformation of systems that perpetuate oppression. So we've seen that these systems have been in place since the birth of this country, since the formation of this country. So it's above all a long haul. So are there any words of inspiration or words of advice in terms of, from your community activism standpoint, that you can share to keep momentum going, to address people that see this really as a far, something that's unattainable, or a really radical idea that there may be an equitable society?
Can I ask you a question that's a personal question? And you don't have to answer. What are you? Who are you? Who are you? Who are your people?
Who my people?
Serious.
That's a good question.
Like, no, like where are your people from? Like, who do you rep?
Who do I represent? Right now, I'm just representing myself through
No,
this
I don't mean
question,
group. I
but-
mean sort of like race, ethnicity, background, family, that.
Oh, okay. Well, if you want to know all of that, that's quite a tricky story.
Give me the
I-
nickel version.
Okay, the nickel version. So I am from Western Massachusetts. I grew up in Springfield. And like you, I didn't go to an exam school, but I was part of the METCO program, which meant I went to a wealthy suburban area. And from my parents, my father went to a segregated school in Virginia and happened to move up to Massachusetts. So I come from a family that was not too far from the Jim Crow era of segregation.
So your father went to a Jim Crow black school,
Right.
right?
In
So
Virginia.
the reason
And,
why is because I'm going to answer the question in a different way, depending on your identity. Because we have, you and I, and some other people on this call, and many other people in this country, come from a lineage of people who have our ancestors. I'm making a little bit of an assumption here, but I'm going to say it's probably right. Our ancestors, some of people on this call, we might not know it, but literally some of our ancestors ran for freedom. Like physically were running in woods to get away from people who were chasing them with dogs and torches and pitchforks and chains, right? And they made it, right? Some of our brethren and sistren didn't make it. And so those people never had, progeny. They never had children. So their lines ended. But we literally, Black people in this country, some of us, many of us, our ancestors are the ones who made it, right? They're the ones who got free. And we exist because they got free. And we forget, a lot of people are like, we were enslaved and we were slaves and it was bad. It's like, man, we taught the entire world. There's no one in the world that fights for freedom, for liberation of their people, and doesn't know what Black people did for freedom in this country. Because if you are in right now, if you're in the Philippines and you're saying Duterte is a terrible person and we need to be free, people are like, what do Black people do? Right? South Africans, when they were fighting for liberation of South Africa, they were like, what are they doing in the United States? Gandhi, like the civil rights movement here followed Gandhi, but they were also like, what did they do in the United States? Like in slavery, what did they do? The Underground Railroad, that's okay. Since the moment, I can tell you when it started. When Black people, specifically Black women, started fighting for freedom in this country. That's not me. Oh, sorry. When Black people started fighting for freedom in this country was the day that the first woman in chains stepped off a boat onto a beach, probably in Virginia or in Rhode Island, because they were slave ports or ports of enslaved people. And we've been fighting since that moment, and we've been winning since that moment, right? Because we're not free, but we're way more free than we were, right? And that is an exemplar so if you want to think about the United States of America and what freedom, justice, democracy, and liberation looks like, it ain't George Washington, it's Una Judge. And Una Judge was a person enslaved by George Washington. So that thing is like, that's been taken away from us, right? We don't remember that. We don't say like, we come from people who did some of the most amazing things in the history of the world. And we should remember that, right? So I think if we think about that, it's like, we can only win. All we need to do is get together, remember what our ancestors did for us, and hold that forward and organize and fight. And people always ask me, like, how do you do all this work? It's so much work. And I'm like, like, if I went back in my family tree, it's like people did things that I would pee my pants. If I thought, I would like, that's what they did. I'm like, that's terrifying. Like, I would never have done that. Right. But they did. Right. And we are alive. We're human beings. We wouldn't be like, have worse lives. We wouldn't be alive if they didn't make it. Right. If they didn't run fast, if they weren't brave, half the people on this phone call would not be human beings. You wouldn't exist. So if you think you can't do it, they did stuff way harder, way harder. So that's my answer.
Thank you so much. This has been super insightful. We appreciate you, Carl, for coming to this event, taking time out of your very hectic schedule to be here with us. I am super excited. And I would like to thank all the viewers and all the wonderful people who are here on this call, because we're all trying to do the same thing. Our end result is going to be the same, and we all want change. I'd like to believe. So one of the things we are going to be talking about right now, it kind of has some demands. We're going to discuss long-term demands from the city. The city will publicly recommit to create a workforce, including elected and appointed officials and volunteer resources that contain a broad range of diversity, including race, gender, language, life experience, and cultural background, to improve understanding and effectiveness in dealing with all communities by developing concrete strategies and goals. Publicly commit to not hiring or rehiring police officers with prior complaints and extend all the background checks on police officers. We have our immediate demands. This is within 10 days. We demand a public apology from Mayor LaChapelle to AKINE based on her implicit bias towards members of this group, internal affairs records for all complaints against police officers from Easthampton from the past 5 years, regardless of the results of the complaints, records of all school arrests from the past 5 years, middle school and high school. This includes any situation that included a premise, regardless if the interaction led to an arrest. The city will provide a complete background breakdown of the police budget and spending. This will include any additional earnings police officers make on top of their base salary. The city council, school committee, and the mayor will actively look to use funds to supply the internet to 672 students and high need students by the new year, which will be January 2nd, 2021. Chief Alberti will reinvest his payout from the Northampton protest work and turn down his raise received for the fiscal year of 2021 by January 2nd, 2021. Chief Alberti will agree to donate these funds to the current AKINE community initiative to support Easthampton students by helping them access the internet as well as heat. With that being said, everybody, thank you for coming, and we hope that we can do this again. Have a great day and happy holidays.